Hello, everyone. I'm Tanner Linkus, and today I'm going to talk about A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, specifically giving a postmodern and magical realist critique of the short story. First, let's talk about the author, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He was born on March 6, 1927, and died on April 17, 2014. He's the author of 100 Years of Solitude, which won him a Nobel Peace Prize in 1982. He is a key figure in the development of magical realism in Latin American texts. If you Google magical realism, his name is sure to pop up. Common themes in his writing are the effects of colonization, aging, family, militarization, the Catholic Church, magic, and soledad. Now, soledad roughly translates to solitude in English, but to Latin Americans it means a lot more than that. An entire slideshow could be given about the meanings and the subtleties of soledad, but I'll just say here that it heavily relates to the Virgin Mary. Now let's talk about postmodernism from our very text. In a word, the modernist laments fragmentation while the postmodernist celebrates it. So although both of these movements deal with the same topics, they have very different approaches. So it's important to understand modernism in order to understand postmodernism, and vice versa. Many modernists also viewed art as a potentially integrating restorative force, a hedge against the cacophony and chaos that postmodernist works often imitate or even celebrate, from our Bedford text. So that goes into higher detail of how postmodernists view things differently than modernists. Now let's talk about magical realism. It's a multicultural approach to writing. For example, Haruki Murakami, a Japanese author, is a magical realist. Toni Morrison, an American author. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, of course, and others like Rudolfo Anaya, and several more Latin American authors. The term magical realism was originally used to describe German paintings. But magical realism eventually came to be used by Latin American authors in their writings. Works of magic realism are set in the real world and treat the magical or supernatural as an inherent, even mundane part of reality requiring no explanation. That's given by our Bedford text on page 279. How is magical realism a part of postmodern interpretation? Well, let's get into that now. The unmediated way in which these different realities are presented means that magical realism also blurs the boundary between fact and fiction, another characteristic that locates magical realism within postmodernism. Those are the words of Wendy B. Ferris, a notable critic on postmodernism and magical realism. What she's saying here is that since there's that blurred boundary, since there's that obscurity, it puts magical realism firmly within postmodernism. Another point, the magical allows for the reader to create as well as the author, which is something that is very postmodernist. It's not just this is what the author says. They are not a authority on the text. We create as well as they do. Magical realism tends to celebrate the strangeness of life rather than wish for a return to simpler times. It celebrates, but it also can just imitate. As we see in this story, there is some celebration, but not as much as there is just imitation. So now getting into the story itself, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings as a magical realist story. The story is not an example of the fantastic. It completely lacks any antinomy or narrative hesitation. Rather, the existence of winged men is accepted by all. Only the angelic interpretation of wings is susceptible to question. This is given by another postmodern critic, Watson. And what it's saying is it's unexplainable and it happens immediately. And the only thing that's really called into question is an explanation of it. The wings resist any attempt at interpretation, just like the crabs in the story and the girl who turns into a spider. There's no real world explanation for any of this. There's no scientific reason. It's just there, and you either accept it or you don't. But instead of worrisome, these magical elements are a cause for awe. There's plenty of people that come around from all over to see it. And the Pelayo's family profits heavily from this. So it's definitely not something to fear, which makes it markedly postmodernist rather than modernist. If T.S. Eliot were to read this, he would be lamenting and, oh, it's so terrible. But we don't see characters do that in here. And, well, Eliot probably wouldn't like this story at all. All right, so now I want to get into spectacle in a very old man and how it's a reflection of the postmodern world. And all of the supernatural elements contain this element of spectacle. And the spectacle dictates the focus of the story. And there's a possible symbology between the crabs, the old man, and Spider Girl. The crabs can be seen to represent kind of a natural world, because that's just the setting. They're near a beach, and these crabs just get into the house. It's something you have to deal with. But then the focus shifts from the Pelayo family and from these crabs, this native land, to religion when the old man comes. And he has enormous wings, and people say he's an angel. The Pope is called. And then there's a turn to secular stories. The Spider Girl, her backstory reads like a fable. She disobeyed her parents and was then turned into this spider creature. It's a motif for life in the postmodern world and an imitation of its strange nature. So how these characters are sent looking at one thing and then they start looking at another, it reminded me of how we see advertisements on television. They're meant to just grab our attention, much like these supernatural elements. So you see a animated talking gecko trying to sell you insurance, and then the next second you see a baby peanut trying to sell you peanuts, and then you see an ad with Shaquille O'Neal selling you gold bond. So they're meant to grab your attention. They don't really make sense. There's not really an explanation, but it's not really something to be upset about like a modernist. And another thing I want to get into a little bit is comic spectacle. The story has many elements of comedy, and one quote that I found that illustrates this is on page 2. That pitiful man who looked more like a huge decrepit hen among the fascinated chickens. So this is an example of how it's supposed to be seen as comedic rather than something to lament or hate. The spectacle is something to be laughed at. The way that we act is amusing, not something that should keep you up at night. But yes, that's what I had on the story. If you have any questions, I'm not sure where I'll upload this, but maybe on D2L, or you could email me, and we can talk more there. Thank you.